Hi guys, it's Mrs. Vance again. This is part 5 of Unit 14 notes. Today's topic is the flow of energy and matter. And so, of course, you know that all living things require energy and they require various kinds of chemicals. The interaction of these and with the members of the communities in the ecosystem are really important to ecosystem stability. So when we talk about flow of matter and energy, we talk about something called trophic levels. Trophic levels have to do with what eats what, okay? It has to do with food chains, food webs, and so forth. So this is a pattern of feeding relationships, okay? And so remember that you're going to go from producers to primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. So what this does is this is called moving from one trophic level to the next. This is a food chain, and this moves the chemical nutrients and the energy from the producers up through the food chain through the trophic levels in the community. And that has to do with how stable the community is. So just for some examples of what we have here, producers are the autotrophs, of course, that are supporting everything else. In terrestrial food chains, ones on land, that's going to be plants. In the ocean, of course, aquatic food chains are going to be things like phytoplankton and algae. And those are the producers on which the primary consumers eat, okay? In the terrestrial food chain, that might be a grasshopper or some other kind of insect or some kind of other kind of animal. In the ocean, that would be something like zooplankton, would be the phytoplankton, sometimes small fish as well. Secondary consumers would be those that eat the primary consumers. So in the case of the terrestrial food chain, in this example, that would be the mouse. And in the ocean, in the aquatic food chain, it would be the herring or some other kind of fish, medium-sized fish like that. The tertiary consumers would eat the secondary consumers. So that might be a snake or it might be a tuna. And then the quaternary, the highest level of consumer would be the quaternary consumer, and that's would be the hawk in the terrestrial food chain and the killer whale in the aquatic one. And so just so you know, this is all the series of the feeding patterns. The trophic levels would be the feeding patterns within the ecosystem. So we also have in the trophic levels, we have detritivores. Detritivores are organisms like the earthworm here that consume the dead material that's left over at all the different trophic levels. And then we also have decomposers. Decomposers are generally bacteria or fungi, and both of those secrete enzymes that break down molecules in the organic materials around and then convert them into inorganic forms that can be used by the plants and get back into the food chain. So really important, the detritivores and the decomposers are an extremely important part of the trophic levels in any ecosystem because you've got to be able to recycle that matter. So remember that a food web is a network of food chains where you have different kind of feeding relationships within there. Consumers can eat more than one type of producer. Several different species of consumers can feed on the same species of producer or the same species of primary consumer for that matter. And when you draw food chains and food webs, remember that the arrow always points in the direction the energy flows. An easy way to think of it is that the food points the arrow points from the food to the consumer. So for instance, in this example, from the grass to the mouse. And then the lynx eats the mouse, then that would be from the mouse, which would be the food, to the lynx, which would be the consumer, and so forth. And so all the interconnected food chains would be the food web. Now, a more realistic view is looking at this food web like this. This is an example of a desert food web that you might see out, in the west somewhere. And so you've got, first of all, the producers, the plants, the mesquite, the brittlebush, the prickly pear, the saguaro cactus, and all the other kinds of plant material that may be present there. The first nutrient transfer and energy transfer will be from the producers to the primary consumers. So all the different animals that would eat the plant material, like the harvester ants or the grasshoppers or the mouse, the kangaroo rat, and so forth. It depends on where you are. In this particular one, we've got a lot of different things here that feed on these different plants, different parts of the plants. Then the next level would be the secondary consumers. The secondary consumers are those that would consume the primary consumers. So, for instance, a praying mantis or the grasshopper mouse might eat both the plant and the grasshopper, and so forth. Red-tailed hawk, if the red-tailed hawk eats this kangaroo rat, then that would make it a secondary consumer as well. And then finally, at the upper level, then you've got tertiary consumers. You've got those that eat the secondary consumers, and so things like the owl and the hawk would also be in that category, as well as the rattlesnake. And so you see that there's a much more complex interplay of food to consumer. So the big thing is to realize that that some of these animals are going to be eating at different levels depending on what it is they're eating. When the hawk eats the kangaroo rat, it would be a secondary consumer. When it eats the grasshopper mouse that ate the grasshopper, that ate the plant, then that would make it a tertiary consumer, and so forth. So there are lots of different feeding relationships there. It's much more complex because animals weave into the web at more than one trophic level. Now, another topic within the energy and matter transfer is something called primary production. And primary production is what sets the energy that's available in an ecosystem. This is the conversion of the solar energy to chemical energy by photosynthesis, and has to do with what happens with the plants. The total amount of primary production in a given time is called gross primary production, and then the net primary production is what's left over from the energy that the producers use themselves, the amount of organic material that's added in a given period that is available to the consumers in the ecosystem. And so here you see the average net primary production of various kinds of plants in various biomes and ecosystems. Algae beds and coral reefs, very, very high here. So is the tropical rainforest, and you see that there's relatively smaller amounts of primary production that occurs in these different kinds of ecosystems. Now, when we talk about ecosystem ecology, we've got to talk about the energy flow as well as the chemical cycling that we have there, because remember, the ecosystem has all the organisms in the community and the abiotic or non-living environment that they live in. So remember also that energy flows through the components of the ecosystem, from light energy to chemical energy to heat energy. But chemical cycling of the nutrients is done by recycling within the ecosystem, because we get new energy all the time from the sun. We don't get new matter. All the matter that is here on Earth is all the matter we've ever had. The energy supply available limits how long the food chain can be. So here we see a pyramid of production, okay, that shows the flow of energy from the producers to the primary and secondary and tertiary consumers. What we notice here is that in the amount of energy that is available in the producer level, only about 10% of that is passed along to the next trophic level, to the primary consumers, and only about 10% of the available energy in the primary consumers is passed on to the secondary consumers, and so forth. So as we move up the energy pyramid, we can see that there's less and less energy available. And so what we see there also is something called a biomass pyramid, where we have a lot more producers and then primary consumers, and then fewer secondary consumers, and even fewer tertiary consumers there, because the energy supply is going to limit how long that food chain can be. When we eat grain or fruit, we would be considered primary consumers, okay? And remember, the primary consumers, so the primary consumers are going to consume the producers here. There's always some energy that is given off as heat, okay, but only about 10% of the energy available in one trophic level, it can be passed on to the next higher trophic level. When we eat beef or meat from herbivores, then we're secondary consumers. When we eat fish, like trout or salmon, we would be tertiary or quaternary consumers. We are converse to what most of you probably think, is that humans are not on the top of the food chain. We don't eat a lot of things that would be at the top of the food chain. We mostly eat, we're mostly a primary and secondary consumer, because we generally eat plant material or herbivores. That's most of what we eat. With some, occasionally, again, when we eat fish, we're more likely to be at the tertiary level than other things, because we don't normally eat the kind of animals that would normally be tertiary consumers. Big thing to remember is human population has a lot more energy available to it when people eat plants instead of herbivores, because there's a whole lot more energy available in that trophic level of the producers. Another thing to think about in terms of ecosystems is that we're recycling not only the biotic elements, the food, the plants and animals, we're also cycling the abiotic parts. Our life depends on the recycling of chemicals. And so some of this cycling is including not only living components, but also non-living or abiotic components. And there are also various kinds of abiotic reservoirs where chemicals can be stockpiled outside of the living things. And so this is talking about something we call biogeochemical cycles. Bio refers to the living components. The geo refers to the earth components, and the chemical has to do with the fact that they're chemicals and they're various cycles. So we're going to look at some various cycles that are important to maintaining the health of an ecosystem. The number one thing is the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle is dependent upon photosynthesis and respiration. It's the major ingredient of all organic molecules. There is an atmospheric reservoir. We have a fair amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. The cycle for carbon cycle is basically a global cycle, and it's found not only in plant and animal tissues, but also in fossil fuels, in soils and sedimentary rocks, as well as dissolved carbon in the ocean. So looking at the carbon cycle is a really important thing for us to understand. You hear a lot about carbon in the news when it's talking about the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causing global warming. And so that's definitely a problem. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the more carbon dioxide is there, kind of acts like the glass in a greenhouse, and it kind of traps the heat in Earth, and that over time Earth does get warmer, and it is currently getting warmer right now. Another cycle that we need to be concerned with is the phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle, there's really not a living reservoir of phosphorus, but it's necessary. Phosphates are necessary in things like nucleic acids, phospholipids, ATP, as well as a component of bones and teeth in animals. And so this is something that depends on the weathering of rock, but those phosphates in the soil and in the water can get into the soil and be incorporated into plants of various kinds and make its way into the food chain or into the cycle that way through the weathering of rocks. The nitrogen cycle depends on bacteria. We have a lot of nitrogen in our atmosphere. We have about 70% nitrogen in our atmosphere, but the only organisms on Earth that can utilize atmospheric nitrogen, gaseous nitrogen, are certain kinds of bacteria. So life is dependent upon these bacteria to provide the kind of nitrogen compounds that can be utilized by plants and therefore consumed by animals. Nitrogen is necessary for proteins, for nucleic acids. All organisms require nitrogen, and oftentimes it is a limiting plant nutrient. In the springtime, when you are getting ready to get your garden ready or fertilize your yard to get it ready to grow in the summertime, one of the things that's added in fertilizer that makes the grass get really green is nitrogen. And the grass really greens up because nitrogen is necessary for it to make all the molecules it needs to make. It's a necessary component. Nitrogen fixation by bacteria that live in the soil and in the roots of certain plants converts nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen gas, to compounds like nitrates and ammonia that can be utilized by plants and therefore then consumed by animals, so that we provide the nitrogen that we need to make the molecules that we require. One thing that's really concerning, though, about some of these things is that when we have a lot of nutrients that come in really fast, like for instance in the spring when everybody's fertilizing their yard and we get lots of rain, a lot of times we end up with too much nitrogen or phosphorus in the ecosystem, and it causes rapid growth of the plants and sometimes can overgrow. In aquatic ecosystems, the primary production there is limited by low levels of both phosphorus and nitrogen. And so when there's more of it, they have a tendency to overgrow and actually end up utilizing all the oxygen in the water, which makes it difficult for other animals, other organisms like animals to live in the water. So too much fertilizer and other sources can cause something called eutrophication, which results in decreased species diversity and oxygen depletion in lakes and rivers and coastal waters.